All right, welcome to Read the Source. Today, Scott Corgan's back to talk to us about Divshot-cli and Nash. Nash is his framework for crafting command line masterpieces in Node.js. Welcome back, Scott.
I appreciate it. Thank you, guys. I
So,
would just like to note real quick, as you continue, I'm interrupting you, that I have the smallest beard. And it's very disappointing. I feel less of a man.
I was hoping that Nick Niemeyer would be able to show up today because he would make us all feel like lesser men.
Yeah, he must be a Linux guy.
Yeah, something like that, definitely.
All right.
Scott, thanks for coming on and talking about, like you talked about superstatic last time you were here, and now we're going to learn more about Divshot's awesome stuff, and the Divshot CLI, which I love, and Nash, which I haven't really seen too much of, but it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Like I said before, anyone that promotes open source the way you do and reads through the code, I think would have been helpful for me when I started coding. I just think it's awesome because open source is the only way, in my opinion.
Couldn't agree more.
Love it.
So,
go ahead.
how do you want to do this? Do you want to run through some Divshot CLI code first before we look at Nash?
Yeah, so I'll kind of give a brief introduction of kind of the areas that I want to touch on today, and then we'll kind of dive into the CLI and kind of see the mess I made and why it shouldn't work, but it does. So yeah, we're gonna look at the Divshot CLI, which is awesome to use, okay to maintain, and we'll see how it is to go through the source code. We're gonna jump into superstatic just for a second to look at kind of how its CLI is set up, because you can run it as a local server, and then we're gonna jump into Nash and kind of look how things are set up there. Is there anything specific that you're looking for in any of these projects that you want to see, or just kind of go through the code?
Yeah, like it's helpful to know what dependencies are useful and what patterns work and which ones don't. I have to admit, I have ulterior motives for inviting you to come and do this one because I've been working on a CLI app for my project Anvil Connect, and it's incredibly difficult in my experience so far to write good CLI apps, and the Divshots really feels solid to me, and so I wanted to learn more about the work you've done on that.
I love it.
Like free consulting.
It's a genius idea. I think most people start podcasts so they can get free education. I'm okay with that. I think the CLI in Node is one of the greatest solutions for the CLI. It's so easy, and I think that there's so little information on running command line applications, which is where Nash came from. So let me see if I can. I'm sure you're sick of looking at me. Let me see if I can get my screen share up, and we can jump into the CLI here. We're good. All right, let's see. All right, so the first file that anyone looks at, I would assume when they're looking at any package having to do with Node is package.json, and they want to see what all these dependencies are. We got quite a few, and kind of the reason we have so many dependencies is not for the sake of it, but because either everything's been broken out because it's used somewhere else, or someone already solved the problem. And I would say the first step to writing a good command line application is don't write anything from scratch. Almost everything's already been solved on NPM. I've seen a lot of developers just rewriting modules over and over, and there's some good ones already on NPM. And we can kind of go through. I think some of the bigger ones that we use that are really helpful are something like Homedir. This is one of my modules. Gets a lot of downloads in a couple big projects, but basically what it does is it gives you access. It gives you the path to the user's home directory, so you can store maybe some dot files or dot folders for settings for the command line. Makes it really helpful. There's some other modules that we don't use that allow you to create config files and read from them and autosave and stuff like that that we don't have in here because we do things a little bit different. Another big dependency is the inquirer. So this is probably one of the biggest modules as far as command line applications are concerned. It allows you to prompt the user for input. I think it's used in Yeoman and in the YoCLI. Excuse me. And it has all sorts of prompts, some good graphical interfaces. It makes getting user input easy, and it's been fantastic. We see a bunch of obviously Lodash. I mean, that's a given.
Hey Scott, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
How would you recommend for people who are going to build their first Node package or even I/O package? How would they kind of research what's best and what to use? Like, how do you go about picking these?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There is I wish I can remember, and I know that it's kind of weird going onto GitHub while we're doing this. I wish I could remember. There's a module. Let's see, what's that guy's name? I didn't even notice it. Sindre.
Cinderus.
Yeah. What's his GitHub username?
Sindrous, I think.
OUS. Yeah. Nope. Okay. Anyway, so if maybe we can post it later, and I was just looking through my. We can post it later, but he has a GitHub repo that lists all these modules that have solved all these problems for command line. Bummer Nash isn't on there, but most of the modules on there are things like Inquirer and those types of modules, how to get user input, how to write config files, how to do various things like that, and it's really helpful. I think after we're done, maybe while we're talking, it'll be easy to find. If one of you guys want to kind of look around while I'm talking at that guy's GitHub repos, you might be able to find it. But does that kind of answer your question? Kind of, because I don't have the answer.
No, that answers it. It's just yeah, I know sometimes it can be overwhelming with all of the packages that are available, and now we have JSPM and other package managers that are emerging.
Yeah, I would say if you're going to do a command line app, NPM is really the only one you should be using. My opinion is that NPM is the greatest package manager that ever exists. In fact, it's the sole reason that I haven't tried to do more in other languages is because their package managers just aren't like NPM. And it sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's really helpful. NPM has pretty good search now. It kind of has a good algorithm for the most popular packages. So if you're going to search it, say here's a good package called Open. And what it does is it allows you to open the browser from the command line to any URL, and it opens their default browser. But if you're looking for a module like that, you could go onto NPM and you could type open browser, and this module is going to show up probably as number one. There's another one called OP, 3 letters, that might show up as well, but they're usually organized by most downloads, most depended on, things like that. So you can find packages that are pretty dependable. In fact, this package Open is one we depend on a lot in the CLI, and I'll show it to you because when you log into the Divshot CLI, it opens up the browser and you can authenticate in the browser, which happened to be the most secure way for us and the easiest way to allow like GitHub login from the CLI and things like that. And so we use this Open module heavily, as we'll see moving forward. Another good module we use, Promptly. This one is kind of like Inquirer, but it kind of prompts the user to get more user input. It's one we had started with originally, and it's kind of a remnant of where we were. But yeah, it's another good module. And then obviously Request does everything for us as far as our API calls. Well, almost everything. Another big dependency, super static. Obviously, you can run Divshot server, and I'll go through more of the commands as we go through and kind of see how they're laid out. But as you can see, we're not even running the latest super static because that gets to be integrated into Divshot, but we heavily depend on that. And then all command line applications should run update notifier, which comes out of Yeoman, the OCI. And basically what this does is it does a very creative way to only check however often you tell it to for the latest version of your application. If there's a new version, it displays a notification before your command runs that there's a new every hour, every day, every week, every month, whatever you want it to do. We currently have it set to check every week for the latest version because we tend to deploy 1 or 2 new versions a week, and that gets really helpful. We don't have tests wrapped around the command line. That's actually in Divshot-CLI version 2. Will be wrapped in tests. We'll have continuous deployment with tests. So that's why our dev dependency is only JS hint. And even that we really don't push hard for that. But we're working on. We're not too excited. We don't have around it. But the good news is it's pretty modular in how we set up the commands, so we don't change anything that affects other things. So the only thing that could break maybe is the command we're working on. But we do heavy manual testing before we publish. So any questions kind of in this package.json?
Yeah, there's all this stuff in there, and so I'm starting to. I mean, I've looked at Nash and I've tinkered with it a little bit. But could you give us kind of a high level of what, within all these other dependencies and within Divshot-CLI, what exactly is Nash doing? What's its role there?
Yeah, so basically what Nash does, and I can kind of show you, this is kind of an older version of Nash, but what I can do is let me open up Nash here, and actually let me go into Nash's repository here, and basically what Nash does is it allows you to when you execute a file, so every command line app's going to have a file that gets executed, kind of its main function, if you're talking in terms of C or C++. And when that file runs, Nash is going to read the argv option from the process object that gets thrown into the globals for Node, and it's going to parse any information that's typed into the command line, and then go through and execute anything you've set up. So if you look at at Nash as a CLI, you have these things called commands and flags. And so an example of that, let me run into the let me go back, sorry. Let me run into the Divshot-CLI command list here. If you look at the command list, so an example of a command would be like create. So if you go into your command line, and let me get this bigger for you guys. So if you go into the command line, you type divshot create. The application your computer is going to run is divshot, and the command in this case that Nash is going to parse is the word create. And so there's all sorts of options. We have things called flags, so anything that has 2 dashes in a word or a single dash in a letter is a flag. Example, if you want to do a custom token, and this is good for continuous deployment and things like on Travis CI or CodeShip, you would have -- token or whatever your token is. Let me show you an example of that. In Nash, commands and flags. Here's an example of it. If you want to create a command, you instantiate a new object for Nash, and you're going to do command list. And so what's going to happen when your application runs and it parses it, it sees the command list, it's going to execute this handler. And so it really gives you a really easy way to parse whatever goes in from the command line user input into your application. Another example would be the flags. So when the user does a -p flag, it's going to run this handler. And that gets really useful when when you need to set defaults and different things like that. But as far as the Divshot-CLI is concerned, it's going to parse these different commands here. All the way down here, there's a bunch of them, and it's going to also parse these flags. And we do different types of executions. The handlers contain different types of code logic, as we'll see in a little bit, depending on what flag is called and depending on what command is called. Does that answer your question?
Scott, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good.
So Scott, I mean, I'm on a Mac, and I know that it works awesome on the Mac, but what about like Windows?
Yep, it works on Linux, Mac, and Windows, all of it.
Okay, and is that handled underneath by some of those modules, or did you have to write that?
So that was kind of the headache that we had. That's why I wrote that home-dir module, is because I needed a way to get the user's home directory cross-platform so that we can store our configuration information. But the majority of these commands are just making API calls. One of the main ones that don't make API calls, just this init command. Basically, it just initiates a Divshot application, and what that does is it creates a divshot.json file, it creates a default index.html file, an error.html file, and it gives the option to create an app on the Divshot hosting platform. And that writes to the file system, but I mean that's just basic, file writing. That's handled in Node. Node kind of handles that cross-platform. So there's not too much as far as cross-platform that we had to deal with. Was there something specifically that you have a headache with, and maybe we kind of touched on it?
No, I don't. I don't specifically, but I know some of my former colleagues and some colleagues now. They're on Windows, and they, whenever I say, "Oh, just use npm or just use Bower for things," they cringe a little.
Yeah, the only headaches you're going to find is if you have to compile, if they're native modules and you have to compile C or C++. But most of those are handled by a module called NaN, N-A-N, which does the connecting between V8 and your system, and really kind of takes all those headaches away. So there really shouldn't be too many issues between cross-platform when you're kind of developing these command line applications when it comes to Node and NPM.
Very cool. Thank you.
All right. So, any other questions before we kind of jump into some of the code in the CLI?
Just a quick comment, which is that things like this being cross-platform are the reasons that you want to use something like Nash instead of starting from scratch, because those are really tough problems to get right and take a lot of time and energy. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a good comment. One of the battles we're facing at Divshot is in order to install a CLI, you have to have npm and Node already installed, and we've had not too many people, but one or two people kind of not allowed to install that stuff on their maybe work machines if it's a kind of an enterprise situation. And so one of the things we've been looking into, there's an awesome library, I forget the name of it, man, I should have researched this, but it allows you to compile your Node CLI apps into an executable cross-platform, which is really helpful. The only stipulation it has is it can't compile core Node modules, which isn't a help at all. I mean, if you're using things like the core FS module or the core path module, it kind of defeats the purpose. But to see that there's that kind of headway being made into compiling these types of things into standalone executables would be really helpful in writing applications in JavaScript, especially command line ones.
One of the things I've noticed in managing dependencies in Node, especially, like, are you tagging your versions so that if let's say I work at a large corporation and that corporation has a risk assessment program and they say, okay, you can use Node 0.8 point something, and you start to cringe because that's way behind. But is there like a way that you could go back and use earlier versions of this?
Yeah, so Node 0.10.34 broke everything because it released some patch that broke the Amazon npm package to communicate with their API, and so we rely heavy on that because we deploy to Amazon and we serve all our files, and we use a lot of the AWS infrastructure, and so this works back to 0.8, but that specific release, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is one of the headaches we had is you can't limit what versions of Node this is allowed to install on, especially as they move to NPM version 3. You're not even allowed to define the engines. And so this is kind of a long answer to your question, but that kind of gave us this headache. So, but the beauty of it is we do offer all these release. The last time we did like an actual detailed release before the changelog was 1.0, but we have releases going all the way back to any version. Every version we've released on NPM, we've tagged on GitHub, and we do that with all our open source stuff, so that you can go back and those kind of headaches. And we've had several users have to go back and install earlier versions for maybe we deployed something that broke, or Node deployed something that broke, or they needed a feature that we removed, and so they have an earlier version and things like that. So
yeah, thank you. That's a good answer.
yeah, so yeah, everything we do is Semver, and so we try to do the patch, minor, major, and so anytime we add a feature, we just patch the minor. Anytime we break anything, we patch the major. So and anytime it's just a bug fix, we're just on the third dot and kind of increasing that. So pretty straightforward. Yeah, we're working heavily on version 2 right now, and it doesn't really break anything, but it's kind of a rewrite of everything, like I said before, with tests and a newer version of Nash, as we'll get into later. But so all right, well let's jump into kind of where everything starts. So with the CLI, everything starts with in this index.js. Well, actually everything starts in the bin folder with divshot.js. And kind of one of the things I've learned over the past year and a half, working on this CLI, was that you shouldn't put all your logic into your executable file for the sake of testing. Now, we don't run a lot of tests on the CLI, automated tests. We do a lot of manual testing. But in something like superstatic, we do. And so a way to test the CLI is you've got to be able to require the file that gets executed. So require the file that gets executed. And so this executed file calls CLI.run, as we'll see in a moment, and having this call allows me to run automated tests on a CLI project, because I can call CLI.run within my tests. And I've seen a lot of command line applications just have all their logic, like all this logic would be in their executed file, but there's no exports, so I can't actually test the command. So that's why our executed file here is so small. Basically, all this file is doing is running the update notifier here, and which I don't want to test because they tested it, and then it just passes the argv from the process into the CLI and runs it, which is awesome. So then I don't even have to look at this file. We wouldn't test this file, but this is kind of where we funnel everything in, kind of our main as we get into it. And it just calls CLI.run, which is exported right here in index.js. And I'll show you. We'll jump up back to the beginning to kind of see how all this kind of gets set up. Something I like to do, I like to put all my core modules in a group. I like to put all my NPM modules in a group, and I like to put all my local requires into a group, so that I can it's just visually something I like to do. Nothing you have to do, but it's kind of helpful. And then I like to kind of separate my constants into their own group. Then I like to kind of separate my variable declarations into their own group. And I like to, this is kind of a pattern that I do before I even get to all the logic. It just kind of helps to organize things. So basically what's going on here is that we have these two things, these two objects that get instantiated here. User and CWD, which is current working directory. What these do, user is an object that gets instantiated, and I can open that up in a second, but basically all it does is it allows me to perform action on the local user's configuration. So things like what's the token for this user? What's their home directory? Things like that, which are very helpful when having to look at various settings for your applications and things like that. It doesn't do too much, but this CWD object really is a helper that lets me mutate and read the current working directory that you're in. Because when you use the CLI, you're going to be in your app's directory. So pretend I'm in an application. In fact, I can get into mine. This is just like a test app that I do. You're going to run divshot something in here, divshot whatever. And the CWD object here is going to do the heavy lifting as far as reading what's the path to this current working directory, what's the name of the app of the directory, and is this directory a divshot app, things like that. And those files aren't too exciting. They're just basically prototypes that read various config files here. I don't think it's worth our time to kind of go through them unless you guys do, but just know those are the two heavy lifters that allow us to do a lot of local work as far as the CLI is concerned. And then, moving forward, the old version of Nash, and I'm going to keep referencing that, allows you to automatically parse a help screen. So if you come here and if you go divshot help, divshot-h, you see this awesome screen come up that has all this stuff is parsed on the fly. So if I add a new command, it automatically does it all for me. And as we're going to see in the new version of Nash, it doesn't do that anymore. And I'll explain why as we get there. But one of the reasons is modularity and the plugin system that's available in Nash 2.0. But we're running an older version of Nash on the CLI, less than 1.0, and it did it all for us. So we pass in these descriptions, we pass in this title, what color we want, everything. These kind of ridiculous things that you do in the first version of your frameworks that are just very verbose and unneeded. And we kind of strip that out, but we pass these things in because we think these help screens are very effective. Another thing, go ahead.
No, do you also do like man pages, I guess, for like each command? Like if I did a command -h, do you have that as well?
Yeah. So if you go divshot-h and you go to like push, let's do env. So this is all automated as well. It's kind of on separate lines because of how big the font is, but it tells you how to use it. It tells you some subtasks. We kind of model the CLI after like the Heroku tool belt. So we have a command, divshot-env. We have a subtask of env called add or pull or remove. And each of these, it kind of tells you how to use them, and then it shows you options that are available for that command, whether they be global or specific to that command. So does that answer your question?
Totally. That's great.
Yeah, so super helpful. So we'll talk more about that later as well. One of the bad things we do in the early versions of Nash that we are doing here in the Divshot CLI is add custom properties to the prototype, which seemed a good idea at the time, but it's really easy to break everything when you do that. And we kind of solved that problem in Nash 2 with set and get functions, kind of like Backbone, that allow you to do command line wide values. And but for now, in Nash, we kind of set our API. So we have this awesome API wrapper that we use, so we don't have to remember endpoints, that we just kind of instantiate and throw onto the CLI prototype that allows us to access that in the various commands, which isn't the best pattern, but it allowed us to do a lot at the time. Again, we just throw in the user command and various different things. So once that's instantiated, we have this thing called dumper here, and it's called divshot dumper. And basically what that does is it listens to any errors on the process, and if any errors occur, like when you have an npm error, you get that npm-debug.log file that allows you to debug. We kind of needed something like that, especially we had the static showdown recently for Divshot, and we have this virtual hackathon, and we have all these people using our CLI, and if they run into an error, we want some error logs to be dumped. And so basically, we don't have time to go through that file, but it listened for any errors, and it dumped a file into their current directory and allowed them to send us that information, or so they can debug, so that we can kind of see where things are at. So yeah, up to this point, this is all just instantiating everything, nothing exciting. I kind of probably spent too much time on that. But any questions up to that point?
It's pretty clear, actually.
All right, fair enough. So this is when we get into what Nash does for CLI and how the CLI is kind of set up for Divshot. But here we start instantiating global flags. So with Nash, you have this awesome feature to do global flags or command-specific flags, which is really helpful. And you can choose whether or not the command-specific flags override the global flags, run in series, run in parallel, and it just makes it really helpful. So we have this feature in the CLI, so if you want to perform a command like divshot push to production, but you don't want to do it on the app in the directory you're in, you want to do a custom app, you can type --app and then the name of some app. which makes it really helpful. And so this flag here allows you to define that. So what this does is says, hey, define this flag. And what's awesome about Nash is you can this handler will execute on anything you put in here. So if someone misspells it, if you want to do any misspellings, or if you want to do any shortcuts like -A and things like that, this handler right here will get executed when any of these are present on that command that you run. Very helpful, and that was one of the headaches we faced. Was what if they don't like the word push and they want the word deploy, or whatever, or they misspell the word push, or they misspell the word app. We wanted a way to handle that, and there are some other modules that kind of do that, but this just seemed like the most straightforward way, and so it's really helpful. So anytime it saw the --app or the -A, it's going to execute this handler, and then it's going to override this app name. So again, there's this object, the CWD object. When it gets instantiated, it fills the information in the object with the current app's information, so whatever's in your divshot.json file. And when you're going to overwrite it, one of the patterns we discovered is that let's have every command assume that the CWD object has all the information it needs. I don't want the commands to handle, well, am I doing the current app, or do I got to read the flag and override the app name? So when this flag gets run, this handler, it overrides that app name, and then so every command can just assume that when it's getting the app name from this object, that it's the app name it wants, or it's the app name that it needs. So a really cool pattern to kind of move that that kind of functionality out of the commands and into these flags. Really helpful. Again, there's more flags here, not really worth going in. Here's the token one, kind of helpful when you want to set a custom token if you're on a continuous deployment or continuous integration, things like that. And you want to have your token in the environment and deploy that way. Yeah, nothing crazy here. Obviously, a typical version. You can supply your custom configuration file, object, or file name. So you can, when you run a divshot command, if you don't want to use divshot.json and you want to use a different file name, you can just do like -c and then custom.json, whatever the file is. And that flag gets run and it sets the config file name so that, again, so these commands don't have to worry about where they're getting the configuration data from. They just use this object. Yeah, so go ahead.
Sorry, just while we're looking at it, I noticed that you have, I think it's a CLI.log command in there, and I don't think I saw that on Nash. Is that something?
Yeah, so remember, this is an older version.
Okay.
So we had, and I can show, we have a CLI.log, and I used that over console.log because when I was running tests, I didn't want that to write to the log. And so you could put the old Nash into test mode, and it'll just emit events, log events, instead of actually writing to the std out, which allows you to capture that std out and test whether or not it had the correct output that you wanted.
Yep.
So we kind of, and the reason why I did that as well is because the original Nash also allowed you to require a CLI app and use it programmatically instead of executing it from the command line. So I could require the divshot CLI and go divshot.push and give it some various options. But the problem we found with that is that Nash was doing way too much. And so we just assume that if it's a CLI app, it's going to have console.log or process.std.write. Cool. And then it's up to whoever is writing the CLI app to handle whether or not it can be required programmatically or it's just going to be run within the terminal or something like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
Scott, one of the first things you do after you sign up with Divshot is you get the CLI and then you do Divshot login.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything special to how that works with the authentication? Because it pops up in the browser and it looks like it passes data to the browser.
Absolutely. I want to jump into that. That's one of the commands I wanted to get into. So I just kind of wanted to run through how we kind of set everything up. But yeah, let's move on to that. And So we jump into the commands folder here. You can't really see it. I don't know how to make this font bigger. But basically, this folder has all our commands. So really easy, straightforward way to organize it. But let's jump into the login command here. And so basically, what this command does, every command looks the same in Divshot. Module.exports, it exports a function, and the CLI handles how all those functions get required and connected, and just passes in the CLI object, because I didn't want to have to go, variable CLI require, and have to know how to get to my CLI. And so basically, the pattern I use, kind of a dependency injection type of scenario. And so I can pass in any CLI now when I test these commands individually. So, but to answer your question, in the login, I define this command, typical, and I write a handler here. And basically, what this does is it uses our API, like I showed you before. We instantiate the API and put it on the CLI object, and I call generate ticket. And behind the scenes, that function is calling the API. It's asking for a token. It generates this ticket. It stores it. It sends back this authentication token. And with that token in the response, we see, with that token in the response, we generate a URL and we open the browser with it. I created this custom function here, which is required in our helpers. Let me open that real quick. So open with fallback. The reason why we have open with fallback is that we use this open module here, and this open with fallback. So say you're using something like Cloud9, which is a browser-based IDE. It's not going to be able to open the browser from its command line. You can do that on Linux and on Windows and on OS X, but you can't do it if you're using something browser-based. And so it checks to see if it was open browser-based. And if it can't open, it will just display something to command line, like here, paste this URL into your browser. But and it was just kind of a solution that we had to come up with for something we were struggling with. So basically, what it's going to do is it generates that ticket here, and the response gives us an authorized URL. So nothing's hard coded into the CLI. You have to call the API to do everything. And so we attempt to open that browser. So we get this URL, and it opens the browser to that URL. And I can give you an example here. If I could just go Divshot login, I type that. It gets it. It opens my browser, and it asks me to authorize the CLI here. And I can hit that. And right now, what's going on behind the scenes here is it opens this URL. Here's that URL. No one else can open it now. It only worked once for me. And then it says waiting for authorization. So basically what we're doing is we're polling every few seconds to see if you've authorized it yet. And it just keeps polling and polling and polling until you quit. And once it found that it's authorized, it says success, and it stores a token in your user configuration. And it kind of hides that away from you. And now I'm authorized to do whatever I need to in the apps that I'm allowed to work with. And that all kind of happens in this open with fallback. It opens it, authorizes it. It does these set timeout, check auth status. The details of those aren't as important, but it allows us to authorize. And once it's authorized, we can jump down here. So check ticket status. And once it's authorized, we set that token. Remember that user object. It sets that token on the user. It says you've been authenticated, then it ends the process. So any questions kind of how that works through like that? It's actually really simple.
I'm shocked that I actually was able to follow.
Well, good, yeah.
I'm a front-end developer mostly.
Yeah, the beauty with NPM and this open module and things like it is that it's just so easy to do these things because people have already solved these hard problems. So it's not revolutionary. This login kind of flow was actually something that took us a while. I give credit to my boss, Michael Bly. He's M. Bly on GitHub and Twitter, but he came up with this idea and said, hey, try this out, and we did it, and it was so much better because we had such a headache on how do our GitHub login users log into the CLI, and this was the way. Log into the browser, and allows you to have a more visual way of doing it for people that aren't used to the CLI as much. So yeah, any other questions? Kind of how this works?
No, we had Michael and Kevin Chow on the podcast, the web platform podcast, and they are some smart guys. So
yeah, they
pretty
are
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still intimidated by them, but I'm thankful. Yeah. Oh, here's one pattern. I know you guys asked about patterns. Is we have this done function passed into every handler, and what this does specifically in our CLI is that if you call done with the first argument, that's going to be the error. And what's going to happen is that it's going to show an error automatically for you when you try to perform. So if I go divshot push, and I'm not authorized on this app, I'm going to get a nice error. So if I go divshot push, what's an app I'm not authorized to do? Let's just say divshot lander. In the current account, I'm logged. Oh, you know what? I am authorized to do that. So that's not a good example. But it's awesome because it automatically handles showing some red text for you to say it's an error and what the error was. And we kind of separated all our errors into an errors file here. So it's really easy to go through and kind of do spell checks and reuse different errors so it's more consistent across the command line. So,
have you thought about doing something where once it errors out, you could actually have the CLI go to the point in the code, and you could see like you could actually ls into the object and look around, kind of like Pry does for Rails, if you're familiar?
Yeah, not too familiar with that, but yeah, that's something we played around with. But most of the errors you're going to get are authentication errors, specifically for Divshot CLI. This doesn't have to do with any kind of parsing errors or code errors or type errors or anything like that. It has more to do with authentication errors. That's
Gotcha.
Probably 95% of the errors that we display to the user, authentication errors. Some of the other errors would be like there's an error communicating with the API, maybe it returned a 500 or something, and or 503, and in that case, there's no code really to look at. But that may be something helpful in Nash as a plugin. That's actually a really good idea. So, and that's maybe something that's worth pursuing. But that's a good question. So.
Yeah. One other thing. I'm sorry. I'll stop.
No, go ahead.
But, I see a few set timeouts here and there. Are there any race condition issues in here?
Basically, what these set timeouts are for in this specific case was checking the authentication status. I try to use set timeouts as much as possible. I try to avoid them, but we just want to check are they authenticated. That's the only reason we're using it, even apart from set interval. So there's not too many race conditions here that we've seen specifically in login, but yeah, that's all it's for. We don't really use too many set timeouts anywhere else. So. All right. Well, yeah. There's really only one other command. They all are kind of the same. They all export a function that gets that CLI object. And but the only other command I really wanted to look at that I thought would be interesting for us was the push command, which is our main command that people use, our biggest command. We spent the most time in and have really optimized the most. So I kind of want to show you how it's set up. Obviously, again, it exports this function, and we do have like this progress bar when you do push. I can kind of show you divshot push. If I run divshot push, creating the build, well, there's your error I wanted to show you. All right, well, I'm logged into the wrong account right now. But what happens is we have this awesome module called divshot push. And so we don't normally separate out our commands individually, but one of the reasons we decided to pull out the push command into its own module, you can find it at npm divshot-push, was that it allowed us to use that in various environments, because right now our CLI does all the heavy lifting when you deploy an application. It talks to S3, it does all that negotiation and error handling. But what we'd really like to do is push it to a server we call load point and have load point handle all of that, so that it does less load on your local machine and it does more load on us, and that will give you faster deploys. It will give us all sorts of things like deploying to different types of environments, maybe using Git to deploy in the future and things like that. And so all this command does now in the CLI is call this push module, which I want to show you in just a second, with various information. And this push module listens for various events, and then the CLI will respond to those events. Events like when it's done, when there's an error, when the build started and ended, when the hashing is happening, and various things like that. And so I want to jump over out of this command into the actual Divshot push module here. Let me open it up. I already had it open here in the CLI. Jump down here, and anyone can use this push module. If you look at the README here on GitHub, it's really easy to use. You can just require it as long as you have which directory you're in, what environment you want to push to, the configuration for your app, and your authentication token, which we have discussed before. All you got to do is you can call, so you can write all sorts of applications that push to the Divshot service, and it handles all the hashing for you for incremental deploys. It handles the API negotiations. It handles the uploading to the correct services, and all you got to do is listen for events to be emitted, and it just makes things really awesome and really clean and really helpful. Now, this push module does all the heavy lifting. So when we release the CLI, when we released the CLI initially, we deployed every file every time. But as we started to deploy our bigger applications, we started to see that that wasn't something that we could stand. So we incremented a hashing algorithm using Merkle trees, which I'll kind of show you in a second, but it's very, very in detail, and it's kind of boring. But so it allowed us to compare changes in files and only deploy the files that changed. So if you changed one file, you're not going to deploy all 1,000 again. You're only going to deploy one, and then it was our solution to not having Git deployment in our push. And all of that happens if you're in the Divshot push module. You can go into sync tree. Now this file has lots of comments. I didn't write this file. We had someone working with us named Colin that did a lot of this, and there's just a lot going on here that we don't have time to go through everything, but it does a lot of negotiations with S3. It does a lot of the calculations of the Merkle trees using a module called Merkle-dir, and then it does a lot of syncing with our service. So you're welcome to look through that. I don't even fully understand everything that happens in there. It's pretty crazy. But just know that this push module handles everything for you. It's just really awesome for us. So I know it was kind of a vague overview of that push module. Any questions kind of on anything said about the push module?
That's kind of a bonus for me because I've been looking for a Merkle tree module for nodes. So pretty happy with that.
Yeah, Merkle-dir. It hasn't been updated in a while, but it's a fantastic module. So one thing I wanted to note in this module, if you look at the Divshot push module and the README, if you look at there's another decision we had to make. If you look at all these methods, we have on end, on air, on verbose, on upload, on build, on hashing. All these events that get emitted, the reason why I created these methods called on and whatever was because it got kind of ridiculous to type, like CLI or like push.on, upload, start, blah. Having all these colon delineated objects and having to memorize it. So it was way easier to type push.on, upload, start, and then have a callback to it. And it just made a lot more sense to provide methods for various actions that happened, and then they can have some kind of subtasks. And it was just a cleaner approach that gets emitted from this push module. and all that happens, down here in these areas. Start upload. It's going to status.emit hashing start, and then so your on hashing method. We look here. Where are we at? On hashing right here. On hashing start. So you just pass that event in instead of on hashing colon start. It just kind of a side note that it makes it easier when you're designing event emitted APIs. It's a lot easier to provide those types of event listeners rather than requiring your users to listen to these crazy comma or colon delineated kind of events being emitted. So, but yeah, that's Divshot push, I guess, in a nutshell. It makes it really easy for us in our push command to just say, hey, push it, and we're going to listen to all these events being emitted, and we're going to respond to them. Just way easier, really clean API, and it's very helpful for us. So any questions kind of on the push command?
No, this is great. We got about 15 minutes about.
All right. All right, cool. Yeah, I wanted to spend that time then and jump into the Nash module, if that's okay.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so the beauty of Nash is a couple things. Let me show you through the README the beauty of Nash. Well, you have these things called flags, as I showed you. You have global level flags, and you have command level flags. Global level flags can be called when you run anything. Command level flags only are executed when you call that specific command. Very helpful to kind of piece those separately. Another awesome feature of Nash is before all and after all. So this will run before all your commands. This will run after everything, and each command has the same thing in each. So before and after. So it's really a cool way to modularize your code. If you have something that happens on multiple commands, pull it into its own module, and stick it in a before or in a before all, and have it run that way. We have these set and get, like I mentioned before. So instead of setting properties on the prototype of the CLI, set these values here. I can kind of show you here. CLI.set, just typical like Backbone, and it allows you to call the CLI.get later on from anywhere. And one of the headaches that solves is if you're requiring your CLI in various areas, you want to be able to have kind of a state that you can have access to on that instantiated object, and it allows you to pass around various values, and I can kind of show you that here in Superstatic. If you look at kind of the CLI and Superstatics, yeah, we set all these defaults here, and then we register our flags, and in those flags, if they've overridden the defaults, it resets. It says CLI.set port, and it sets those new defaults, and in our commands here, it reads CLI.get. So it just allows this really kind of cross modularity like state kind of built into Nash, and very helpful. And then real quick before we jump into the code, my favorite command, register, which looks like it's broken, but I'll jump down. This allows you to register plugins, which are a really thought out feature kind of based on the Happy module, HAPI, and their plugin system. But what this allows you to do, if you're building a bigger command line application, you don't want everything in one file. And if it's big as well, if you're going to have all these files, why not separate them into modules and require them and then register them? And the beauty of these plugins is, remember I told you that the older version of Nash had the built-in help screen? Well, this new version of Nash doesn't, but what it allows you to do is, I'm in the process of writing a Nash.help module, so if you register that module, it'll decorate all sorts of stuff in Nash to add this functionality and allow you to generate all these help screens. And as you mentioned before about if there's an error thrown going to that specific point in code, that could be a module that or a plugin that's written for Nash that you register specifically for development or something like that, whatever you want, that kind of adds features to Nash. So the idea was not only to have the ability to craft command line masterpieces, but to to be able to decorate it and have it as a platform for building bigger and more robust command line applications. So any questions on that before I quickly dive into pieces of Nash I wanted to show you?
No, it's awesome.
Okay. All right, some of your questions about what modules get used for command line. I mean, one of the most popular is Minimist. That parses the argv and gives you a list of commands and different flags that you can manipulate, and that's at the heart of everything for us. So when you call with Nash CLI.run, you pass in the argv. Specifically, I can show you an example here. You pass in the argv here. It parses all of that, and then that's how Nash knows which flags to run, which commands to run, and things of the sort. So basically what Nash does is when you call Nash, it instantiates an object right here of the CLI prototype, and it builds up. Here's where everything kind of builds up, defaults, and we have this thing called process. So anything on the current process, it generates this object. Here, I'll show you real quick. That's really helpful. What's the current command? What's the current task? What's the current data? What's the current flags? And it kind of freezes that so you can't mess with it. But the beauty of that is when you're anywhere, you have access to the raw data. So if you don't like what Nash gives you, you also have access to the raw data. The internals here is where all the meat is. We have these kind of collections, if you want to call them, of commands and flags that when you run Nash, it does all these parsing, it looks into all these commands and all these flags, and it kind of figures out what to run. And these are all in their own files. You can kind of go look at these classes and see how they're kind of set up, but they do all the helpers. It lets you compare names, it lets you compare misspellings and different things like that, which are really helpful. It helps you run a command. Very helpful like that.
I really love the modularity that you guys strive for with this, and the register function, like you said, that sounds really awesome.
Oh, I haven't had a lot of adoption of Nash outside Divshot, maybe one other module, but I'm yet to see any CLI library or framework that allows you to register plugins like that, because we have a huge program as far as our CLI is concerned. We have lots of commands, maybe 20 or more, and no way to organize it. It's like working with Express. There's no real way to organize it. You're kind of on your own. And,
we used to have it at one place I was at. We used to have a giant bash script that pulled in all these files, and it would do deploys, it would do setups for developers. There was actually two of them, one for setups and one for deployments, and it was just such a mess to work with. So this is really nice clean code and modular. So
yeah, it's really helpful, and like I said, it's really helpful to have those flags and commands and command level flags, and which tend to be the heart of all command line applications. And one of the unique things we have, which is inspired by the Heroku tool belt, was if you run into the command, oh, that's a test. If you run into the command class here, and you look at, we have this, I'm looking for it, let me find it. So it's task. We have this awesome feature that allows you called task. So if we go divshot env pool, so it's the env command, but it's the pool subtask. What this specific command or task does is it allows you to pull your environment data into a local environment file from various environments. And but the beauty of having these subtasks is it's built into it, and it's basically this kind of recursive thing where it just creates a new command, but it becomes a subtask of a higher up command. So it allows you to chain together these types of subtasks into your command if you need to drill deep into various tasks as it relates to a command. And that was kind of a cool idea that Heroku uses, but this is an easy way to, instead of defining a command, env pool, it allows you to define a command like this, env, and then allows you to go task pool, and then allows you to define a handler here like this. and which creates a really clean UI, and in the end allows you to do a lot of parsing and generation for the help file. You asked before if we had the man pages for each one, and we do because of that type of helper, so we can parse these types of subtasks. So, but Nash makes that really easy. Again, you can look at the documentation in Nash here under command and look at task and understand kind of how that works.
Currently, this is on your GitHub.
Yeah, so this was a project I kind of did in my spare time. It's not necessarily a Divshot project, but Divshot uses it. I have a few modules like that, and basically because no one at Divshot wanted to maintain it except for me, so I just put it on my own, and it was useful outside Divshot. And was there a question associated with the comment, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you would have a good amount more adoption. I would imagine if you because it's a hard sell unless you have a lot of contributors and maintainers. If you have one person on a open source project, it's hard to sell it to a company. I think as far as like getting it going. Not that it's bad, but if I see that you're committing to it, daily or weekly or whatever, I know you're committed. But it's there's a lot of projects where we have to look at, well, what's the growth of this, what's happening with this. It's sort of a strange process.
Yeah, no, that's a good comment. I do the same thing. There's a lot of questions on how do you choose the right module in NPM, and a lot of it comes down to how many downloads, what's the commit schedule look like, what company owns it, does a company own it, what kind of license, things like that. And I made the decision to kind of put it under my own repo because I'm really one of the only Node developers at Divshot. So I'm really the only maintainer, and I'm willing to put it wherever it goes, but it just seemed to make much more sense outside the context of Divshot for the time being. And but yeah.
Do you have other people like Colin and other fellow developers helping contribute, or if there's people listening to this now who want to contribute, where can they go for the process for that?
Man, I wish people would contribute more to Nash. Kind of the only contributions I've gotten to Nash was complaints about how stuff didn't work. There's an open issue on the Yo CLI on whether or not to use Nash for Yeoman, and one of the biggest complaints is that it does too much, which is one of the reasons I decided to not to get into the Yeoman ecosystem, but they were right. But I would love to see pull requests. There's some articles going around recently that pull requests with a failing test are far more helpful than opening an issue with no context. And I would love for them. They can go to my repo and submit pull requests, ideas. I would love to see plugins developed for Nash for features that Nash doesn't have. That would be really helpful.
I posted most of the links that we've been going through in the event page for those listening, so that they'll be able to access it there. But your GitHub and Divshot's GitHub are the two main areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got hundreds of repos, and so does Divshot, so it's kind of hard to comb through them. But yeah, for anyone that sees this video, if Nash is something that interests you or has a feature you don't have, please tell me I'm wrong and submit a pull request or create a plugin and add some functionality to it. That'd be really helpful for me, and it might solve some headaches I have right now with the Divshot CLI as far as testing and things like that. So yeah, was there anything specific that you wanted me to touch on as far as code is concerned in Nash? I mean, there's nothing groundbreaking, but I know we're kind of running out of time.
I think it's great work. It seems like it's much simpler than you would imagine based on what it does. Because the Divshot CLI is pretty powerful, I think.
Yeah, it's actually, it's all really simple. When it comes down to it, if you're writing a CLI, you're going to be making API calls. And so basically you're just wrapping HTTP requests in commands and flags. That's really what it comes down to when you're working on with something like a Divshot CLI. So
that's great work, though. Simple doesn't necessarily make it easy, and it's only obvious what the right thing was to do in retrospect. So, I wouldn't want to have to start from scratch and do everything that Nash does.
Well,
Wish
it's there.
done, and I'm going to
Well,
throw it away and use Nash.
well, I would hope too. I know you kind of mentioned that you were working on a CLI app. If Nash is something that you want to use, I would hope that you would tell me where the pain points are for you and
Absolutely.
how I can make things better. I mean, that's the beauty of open source, but kind of the downfall of open source is people are too scared to talk to maintainers because they're intimidated by people who think they're amazing at code. And you'd be surprised how many people kind of specialize in one area but flop around in other areas. So I would highly encourage people to, just at least start the discussion.
Absolutely. It's a problem I run into in my work as well. More people need to get in touch.
If people want to contact you directly, should they grab you on Twitter, or where should they find you?
Yeah. Twitter. You can mention me on Twitter. You can find me, on GitHub. I find sometimes I have to contact people by opening an issue on someone's repo. I'm pretty responsive when it comes to that, and any questions. I mean,
a lot of people put their emails on their GitHub too. So
yeah, my email might be on there. I'm not sure. I mean, those are the easiest ways to get a hold of me. And please, if you see something you don't like, please tell me. Constructive criticism is one of the greatest things ever invented, but highly underused, and so please do that.
And it's at Scott Corgan and Scott Corgan on GitHub, right?
Yeah, perfect. There you go. So, anything else to clarify on any of that?
No, it looks good. Thanks so much for coming and showing us this stuff. That's great.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. Love what you guys are doing. Still, again, please don't stop promoting open source and teaching us how to code.
Thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.